"Dad, can I eat with you?" The voice was so soft it was almost lost amidst the elegant murmur of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the low-toned conversations, and the instrumental music, all seemingly enveloping the space in a distant bubble of luxury. Then, that question pierced the air like an arrow straight to the heart. Julian Harrison, the wealthy businessman, slowly raised his gaze. Standing before him, with small hands clasped at her chest and large eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear, was a street girl. Her beige dress was a little crumpled, her sandals worn, her blonde hair tangled by the wind, but her eyes held something Julian couldn't ignore. On his table sat a meticulously plated dish. A glass of crisp white wine gleamed under the warm garden lights. Everything was perfect. Everything was in its place, except for this child. And for a few seconds, that felt like an eternity, no one breathed. Behind Mr. Harrison, an elegant couple widened their eyes in astonishment. Another woman brought a hand to her mouth as if witnessing something forbidden. A man muttered something about security. The atmosphere tensed, but Julian looked at no one else, only her. The girl spoke again, almost in a whisper. "I haven't eaten today, but I promise not to bother you." The silence grew heavier than gold, and in that instant, something stirred within Julian, something that had been dormant for years. But what he didn't yet know was that this simple question would force him to confront a truth he had avoided his entire life, and what this child carried with her would change his destiny forever. If this story has already touched your heart, subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss any stories that transform the way you see the world. And before we continue, tell us in the comments which city you're listening to this story from. We want to hear from you. Julian looked back at his plate, then at the girl, and instead of calling the waiter, he did something that left everyone speechless. He gently pulled his chair back. "Sit down," he said softly. The girl didn't move at first. She seemed not to believe it. "Really?" she asked. "Yes, but first, tell me your name." "Chloe." Julian felt a strange pressure in his chest. That name echoed from the past. Echoes he had tried to silence for years. Chloe sat down carefully, as if afraid someone might change their mind at any moment. Her hands were small, a little dirty, but they trembled more from nerves than from cold. The waiter approached hastily. "Sir, this isn't appropriate." Julian raised a hand without looking at him. "Bring her a plate just like mine." The murmur around them increased. Some looked with disapproval, others with morbid curiosity, some with genuine surprise. But Julian kept his eyes fixed on the girl. "Where are your parents?" he asked seriously. Chloe looked down. "I don't have a dad, and Mum's sick." That phrase hit harder than any social criticism. Julian felt a knot in his throat. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. Because in those eyes, there was something familiar to him. A mix of pride and hunger, dignity and need. "How old are you?" "5." "5." Exactly the same age his daughter would be if he hadn't allowed pride to destroy his marriage years ago. The thought surfaced unbidden. Julian had built empires, signed multi-million-dollar contracts without hesitation, fired executives without blinking. But at that moment, he didn't know what to do with a little girl who just wanted to share a table. The plate arrived. Chloe looked at it as if it were treasure, but didn't start eating immediately. She looked at Julian first. "Are you sure I can?" Julian nodded, and when she took her first bite, something unexpected happened. It wasn't the scene, it wasn't the curious stares, it wasn't the charitable gesture. It was the way she closed her eyes as she tasted the food, as if it were the best gift in the world, as if she wasn't used to such things, as if every mouthful was a miracle. And Julian felt something he hadn't felt in years: shame. Not for having money, but for never having looked beyond his own walls. "Do you always eat here?" he asked. Chloe shook her head. "Only when someone lets me stay nearby. Sometimes I leave before they kick me out." Julian pressed his lips together. "And today? Why did you approach me?" The girl hesitated, then looked at him intently. "Because you looked like someone I knew." Julian's heart leaped. "Who?" "My dad," she whispered. The world seemed to stop. At another table, someone dropped a fork. Julian felt the air grow denser. "Your dad?" "I don't know," Chloe replied with a sincerity that stung. "Mum says he left when I was a baby, but I think he'll come back someday." Julian looked away for a second, not because he didn't want to see her, but because for the first time in a long while, he feared someone was seeing into him. "What if he doesn't come back?" he asked, almost in a whisper. Chloe shrugged, with a mix of innocence and forced maturity. "Then I'll learn to be brave on my own." That phrase pierced Julian like a mirror, because he had learned to be strong, but not brave. The difference was enormous. Strong was closing his heart, brave was opening it, and at that instant, Julian began to suspect that this girl hadn't arrived at his table by chance. There was something more, something he didn't yet understand, but that would soon force him to confront the past he had buried under contracts, trips, and silence. Chloe continued eating slowly, politely. She didn't devour it. She didn't ask for more. She simply showed gratitude with her eyes, and Julian felt that every second by her side dismantled a part of the armor he had built over the years. However, what he still didn't know was that someone, not far from there, was observing the scene with suppressed tears. And that person knew a secret that would change everything, because that child hadn't chosen this table by chance, and that night wouldn't be just any dinner. It would be the beginning of a truth Julian never imagined he'd hear. And when that truth came to light, nothing would ever be the same. Chloe finished her first plate with a delicacy that didn't match the life she seemed to lead. She left nothing, asked for no more, just took a small sip of water, and looked at Julian as if thanking him for something far greater than the food. Julian wasn't used to such gazes. He was accustomed to interested looks, calculating glances, looks that assessed how much they could get from him. But not this one. This was a clear gaze. A look that asked for no money, just presence. "Does your mum know you're here?" Julian asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Chloe gently shook her head. "She's resting. When she wakes up, her chest hurts a lot, and she gets tired." Julian felt an uncomfortable pressure in his stomach. "Is she sick?" The girl nodded. "She says it's something with her heart, but I think it's sadness." That answer was not typical of a 5-year-old. Julian stopped breathing for a second. Sadness. That word was all too familiar to him. He had seen sadness on the face of the woman who once loved him. He had seen sadness when he decided to prioritize contracts over birthdays. He had seen sadness the day he heard the word divorce, but he had chosen not to look back. Julian had turned pain into productivity, abandonment into ambition, guilt into corporate expansion. And now, a little girl in front of him spoke of sadness as if it were a physical illness. "Where do you live?" he asked cautiously. Chloe pointed towards the main street. "In a small flat. Mum says, it's temporary." Temporary. Julian knew that word well. Many times he had said his absence was temporary, his trips were temporary, his distance was temporary. But years weren't temporary, and neither were wounds. The restaurant remained silent. Some diners pretended not to look, but no one was indifferent. Julian noticed a woman at the back observing them intently. It wasn't a curious gaze. It was an intense stare, as if she were waiting for something. "Does your mum work?" he asked. Chloe hesitated. "She used to. Now she can't do much." Julian began to feel that each answer opened a door he preferred to keep closed. "And how do you eat?" Chloe looked at him with brutal honesty. "Sometimes we eat, sometimes we don't." The phrase fell like a sentence. Julian had investments in 3 countries, accounts that grew even while he slept, properties he didn't even visit. And in front of him was a child who measured her life in sometimes. Sometimes we eat, sometimes we don't. For the first time in years, Julian felt that success filled no real void. "Why did you approach my table specifically?" he asked softly. Chloe looked at him intently. "Because you were alone." That answer caught him off guard. Julian looked around. There were people, noise, luxury. But yes, he was alone. And when someone's alone, Chloe continued, they need company. This child wasn't asking for food. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't asking for charity. She was offering something. Presence. Julian lowered his gaze, remembering nights in 5-star hotels where the silence was louder than any city. He remembered long tables with executives where no one talked about anything real. He remembered the echo of his own empty mansion and understood something uncomfortable. He had built a life surrounded by people, but without anyone. "Are you scared of being alone?" he asked. Chloe shook her head. "Not when I think my dad might be somewhere, thinking of me." Julian felt the air grow heavier. "Do you miss him?" he asked. Chloe nodded. "Even though I don't know him." Yes, that phrase was like an unforgiving mirror, because Julian knew what it was to be missed by someone he had chosen not to see. He knew what it was for a daughter to ask why dad wasn't there. He knew what it was to hear excuses and choose work. The past began to knock on the door of his conscience, but he didn't yet know that door was about to open completely. Suddenly, Chloe did something unexpected. She extended her small hand towards Julian's. "Thanks for letting me sit with you." The contact was minimal, but sufficient. Julian couldn't remember the last time someone took his hand without expecting anything in return. He couldn't remember the last time he felt tenderness without strategy. At that instant, the waiter returned, looking uncomfortable. "Sir, the manager wants to speak with you." Julian looked up. "Tell him I'm busy." The waiter hesitated. "It's about the child." Julian slowly stood up. The restaurant fell silent again. "The child is with me," he said firmly, "and no one is going to remove her." It was the first time in a long while he had defended something that generated no profit. Chloe looked at him as if he were a hero, and that made him uneasy because he knew he wasn't, at least not yet. "Does your mum know you're looking for your dad?" he asked, resuming the conversation. Chloe looked down. "Mum says we shouldn't bother someone who doesn't want to stay." That phrase was a direct hit, because Julian had been exactly that, someone who didn't want to stay. "But I think," Chloe continued, "that sometimes people leave because they're scared." Julian felt something break inside him. Fear. Yes, he had been scared. Scared of not being enough. Scared of failing. Scared of losing control. Scared of loving more than his pride allowed. And out of fear, he had lost more than he would ever admit aloud. "And do you think your dad is scared?" he asked. Chloe looked at him with a wisdom that didn't match her age. "Yes, but one day he'll be brave." Julian couldn't hold her gaze because at that moment he understood that the girl wasn't just talking about her father. She was talking about him. But there was still something more. Something that didn't quite fit. Something in Chloe's eyes. In the way she looked at him. In the way she seemed to recognize him. And then something happened that left him completely still. From the other side of the restaurant, the woman who had been watching them began to approach slowly. Her steps were firm, her gaze intense, her eyes moist. Chloe saw her first, and her expression changed. "Mum." Julian felt the world spin a little slower. The woman stopped a few steps away. She didn't seem surprised, she seemed resolute. Julian looked up at her, and something within his memory ignited. He had seen those eyes before, heard that voice in another time, felt those hands tremble from his absence. But it couldn't be. Not after so many years. The woman took a deep breath. "I didn't know I'd find you like this someday," she said, her voice strained. Julian felt that the past he had so carefully buried had just sat down in front of him, in the form of truth, and what he was about to hear would change everything he thought he knew about that child and about himself. The restaurant seemed to cease existing. The clinking of cutlery, the soft music, the elegant conversations, all suspended in a kind of invisible silence when Chloe's mother stopped in front of the table. Julian felt his heart pound against his chest with a force he hadn't known for years. The woman wore no striking makeup or expensive clothes. Her dress was simple, her hair practically tied back, but her eyes, those eyes hadn't changed. They were the same ones that once looked at him with unconditional love, the same ones that asked him to stay, the same ones that filled with tears the day he decided to leave. She observed him without hatred, without shouting, without immediate reproaches, only with a mature sadness, like someone who has already cried all they could cry. "I didn't know destiny would be so ironic," she finally said. Julian didn't respond. Chloe looked from one to the other, not fully understanding the tension, but sensing that something important was happening. "Mum, he let me sit down," the girl said with innocent pride. The woman nodded. "I saw." Julian felt the pieces beginning to fall into place, but he resisted accepting what his intuition was already screaming. "Do we know each other?" he asked, though deep down he knew the answer. The woman looked at him intently. "More than you imagine." The air grew denser. Julian slowly stood up. His mind traveled back to a period he had decided to erase, to a small flat where love was bigger than money, to promises made without lawyers, to a woman who believed in him when he had nothing. But he did have something. Ambition. And as that ambition began to grow, so did the distance. "It can't be," he finally murmured. The woman held his gaze. "Yes, it can." Chloe watched them curiously. "Mom, do you know him?" The woman took a deep breath before responding. "Yes, darling." Julian felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The past wasn't knocking on the door. The past was sitting right in front of him. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. The woman took another step closer. "You left without looking back," she said with a firm but controlled voice. "You said it was temporary. You said you needed to grow. You said you'd come back when everything was stable." Julian closed his eyes for an instant. Each phrase was an echo of decisions he had justified for years. "And while you grew," she continued, "I learned to survive." The restaurant remained silent. No one dared to interrupt. Chloe looked at her mother, then at Julian. "Is that him?" she asked in a thin voice. The woman didn't respond immediately. She looked Julian directly in the eyes. "You tell her." That challenge was more powerful than any accusation. Julian felt that his pride, the armor that had protected him for so long, was beginning to crack. He looked at Chloe, those eyes, that way she tilted her head, that expression when she smiled shyly. There was something undeniable, something he could no longer ignore. "I didn't know," he whispered. The woman. She didn't raise her voice. "You didn't ask." That phrase was more painful than any shout, because it was true. He didn't ask. He didn't call. He didn't return. He didn't investigate. He didn't want to know. He had chosen the comfort of ignorance. "Mum," Chloe gently tugged at her dress. "Is he my dad?" Time stopped. Julian felt his heart pounding in his ears. The woman knelt in front of the girl. "Yes, darling." The word fell like a definitive sentence. Chloe looked at Julian with a mix of surprise, hope, and confusion. Really? Julian couldn't hold her gaze, because that word forced him to accept something he had avoided for 5 years. Responsibility. He wasn't just a successful businessman. He wasn't just a powerful man. He was a father, and he hadn't been there. Chloe took a small step towards him. "Then why weren't you there?" The question carried no reproach, only innocence. But that innocence was more devastating than any adult accusation. Julian felt something break within his chest, because he had no answer he could give a 5-year-old girl. He couldn't tell her about ambition. He couldn't tell her about contracts. He couldn't explain wounded pride. He could only admit an uncomfortable truth. "Because I was a coward." The woman looked at him, surprised by his honesty. Chloe frowned slightly. "But I said my dad would be brave someday." Julian felt his eyes well up for the first time in years. "You're right," he said, his voice cracking. "And I'm trying to start now." The woman crossed her arms. "Trying doesn't erase 5 years." "I know." That was the first time he hadn't tried to justify himself. He didn't blame fate. He didn't blame work. He didn't blame anyone else. He took responsibility. The silence was profound. Chloe looked at her mother, then at Julian. "So, I'm not alone anymore?" That question was like a light piercing the darkness. Julian knelt down to her level. "You should never have been." The woman looked away for a moment, containing emotions she had learned to suppress. "She doesn't know everything," she finally said. "She doesn't know about the nights without food. She doesn't know about the medical appointments I couldn't afford. She doesn't know my heart hurts not just from illness but from abandonment." Julian felt that every word was a mirror of his decisions. "Are you sick?" he asked, with genuine concern. She nodded. "I need surgery, but I didn't come to ask you for anything." That phrase hit him even harder. There was no demand, no manipulation, just truth. "I didn't know anything," he repeated, though he already understood that phrase wouldn't absolve him. "You didn't want to know," she corrected softly. Chloe watched Julian's face as if trying to memorize every detail. "You look like me," she said with a small smile. Julian felt that affirmation was both a gift and a responsibility. The restaurant slowly began to regain its sounds, but their table remained a world apart. "Where do you live?" he asked. The woman hesitated. Pride still existed. "I don't want your pity." "It's not pity," he replied firmly. "It's responsibility." The difference was enormous. The woman studied him intently. She wasn't looking for money. She was looking for truth. "If you're going to enter her life," she finally said, "you can't do it like someone signing a contract. You can't show up today and disappear tomorrow." Julian felt the weight of each word because he knew that was his tendency. "I don't want to disappear again," he said honestly. Chloe took his hand again. "Then stay." 3 words, so simple, so powerful. Julian understood that this night was not by chance. It wasn't charity. It wasn't a coincidence. It was confrontation. Destiny hadn't led him to that table to pay for a dinner. It had led him to pay an emotional debt, but there was still something more, something the woman hadn't yet said, something still kept hidden. And when that last truth came to light, Julian would have to decide if he was willing to lose his pride or lose everything again, because the true test wouldn't be recognizing his daughter. It would be proving he could be the father she deserved. And that decision was about to arrive. The silence that followed Chloe's words wasn't awkward. It was decisive. Julian remained crouched in front of his daughter, feeling the weight of that small hand in his. It wasn't a fragile hand. It was a hand that had learned to hold its own too soon. Chloe's mother remained standing, observing him with a mix of caution and wariness. There was no hatred in her gaze, but no trust either. There was something more complex, a silent evaluation. She wasn't seeing the man who had knelt before her daughter. She was seeing the man who once promised to stay. "If you really want to be in her life," she finally said with a firm but serene voice, "you can't do it half-heartedly." Julian slowly stood up. He no longer felt like the owner of an empire. He felt like a man facing a moral examination. "I don't want to do it half-heartedly," he replied. She looked at him deeply. "Then listen to me carefully." Chloe watched them in silence, sensing that something important was about to be decided. "I'm not going to accept money without commitment," the mother continued. "I won't allow you to appear as a hero for one night and disappear when the emotion fades." Julian didn't interrupt. "She doesn't need a sponsor," she added. "She needs a father." Those words lodged with surgical precision in Julian's chest. For years he had solved problems by signing checks. He had fixed mistakes by paying compensation. He had bought silence, loyalty, and opportunities. But this wasn't a financial negotiation. It was a test of character. "What do you need from me?" he finally asked. She didn't hesitate. Presence. The word resonated with unexpected force. Presence at medical appointments. Presence on difficult nights. Presence when she asks why you weren't there before. Presence when she's scared. Julian felt each phrase dismantle a part of his ego. "And if you decide to leave again," she continued, "you won't just break her, you'll break me again." The restaurant had already returned to its usual rhythm, but for them, the world remained still. Chloe looked at Julian as if waiting for a promise she couldn't formulate. "I'm not leaving," he said, with a conviction that surprised even himself. The mother studied him in silence. "Time will tell." That phrase was a clear boundary. Trust wouldn't be immediate. Julian took a deep breath. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his schedule. He wasn't calculating risks. He wasn't evaluating profits. He was feeling, and that unsettled him more than any business crisis. "I need to see where you live," he finally said. She frowned slightly. "It's not a place you'd be proud of." "I didn't come for pride," he replied. "I came to take responsibility for what's mine." The mother looked at him for several seconds. There was sincerity, but also uncertainty. "All right," she finally said. Chloe smiled with contained joy. "Then, let's go, all three of us." That simple phrase had enormous meaning. All three of us. Julian felt that word carried a weight he had never considered. For years he had lived in the singular. My company, my goals, my success. Now there was a plural that demanded commitment. My daughter, her mother, our responsibility. They left the restaurant under curious glances. Some whispered, others observed with judgment. But Julian looked at no one else. He walked beside Chloe, aware of every step. The girl took his hand without asking permission, and that naturalness touched him deeply. There was no resentment in her, no reproach, only an openness he didn't know if he deserved. As they walked down less illuminated streets, the contrast became evident. Luxury was left behind. Golden lights became flickering streetlights. Impeccable pavement gave way to uneven footpaths. Julian felt that every step took him further from his comfort zone and closer to a truth he couldn't ignore. They arrived at an old building with faded paint and windows that told stories of resilience. "Here," the mother said. They climbed narrow stairs. Chloe spoke with enthusiasm. "Mum makes yummy soup when she can and reads me stories even when she's tired. And she says your heart heals with hope." Julian swallowed. This woman had not only raised their daughter alone, she had protected her innocence. They entered the small flat. It was modest, but clean, tidy, well kept. There were drawings taped to the wall, a small worn sofa, a simple table, nothing luxurious. But there was something he didn't have in his mansion: warmth. Julian observed every detail, as if evaluating a reality he never wanted to look at. "It's not much," the mother said, anticipating judgment. "It's enough to show you fought," he replied. She looked at him in surprise. Chloe ran to a drawer and pulled out a drawing. "Look," she said excitedly. "I made it for when my dad came back." Julian felt the air stop. It was a simple drawing. 3 figures, holding hands, a bright sun, a small house. Above, written in childish letters, "My family." Julian felt something break inside him. There was a family drawn, a family that existed in his daughter's imagination, but that he had ignored in reality. "I kept it," Chloe said, "because I knew it would happen someday." Julian couldn't speak for a few seconds. The mother watched him, not seeking to move him. She sought to understand if he was grasping the magnitude of what he had lost. "You need an operation," he finally said, returning to the pending conversation. She nodded. "Yes, And it's not cheap. I'll take care of it. She gently raised her hand. I don't just want you to pay. Julian looked at her, understanding what she was really asking. I want you to be in the waiting room. I want you to explain to your daughter why Mum is going into surgery. I want that if something goes wrong, she isn't left alone. Julian felt that every word forced him to leave his old self behind. He couldn't solve that with money, only with real commitment. I'll be there, he said. She held his gaze. Then start now. Chloe approached and hugged Julian's legs. A spontaneous, natural gesture, without reservations. He hesitated for a second, and then awkwardly hugged her back. He didn't know exactly how to do it, but he knew he didn't want to let her go. In that small flat, far from luxury and cameras, Julian understood something fundamental. True power wasn't controlling markets. It was holding small hands when fear appeared. But there was still something more, something the mother hadn't yet said, a detail that would completely change the way he understood the past. She sat down slowly on the sofa. There's something you need to know. Julian looked at her intently. When I left the hospital the day she was born, I tried to call you. Julian frowned. I never got that call. She nodded. I know, because someone blocked my number. The silence was immediate. What do you mean? She took a deep breath. Your assistant at the time told me you didn't want to know anything, that you were focused on an important business deal, that I shouldn't insist. Julian felt his blood run cold. He vaguely remembered that period, a crucial negotiation, an international trip, a series of filters on his phone to avoid distractions. I never asked for that, he whispered. She looked at him with a mix of sadness and resignation. But you allowed it. That phrase was an unexpected blow. It wasn't just an external betrayal, it was a consequence of his own carelessness. He had delegated so much of his life that someone else decided what news reached him. And the most important news never did. Julian felt a mix of rage and guilt. He couldn't completely blame a third party. He had built a wall around his time, and that wall blocked what mattered most. I need to know everything, he said firmly. She nodded. Then be prepared. Because what's coming isn't comfortable. Julian understood that the real story was just beginning. It wasn't just a reunion. It wasn't just a discovered daughter. It was a chain of ill-made decisions, a series of silences, a parallel life that grew without him. And now he would have to decide if he was willing to rebuild from the foundations. Because loving wouldn't be enough. He would have to prove it. And the test was just beginning. The small flat fell silent after that revelation. The number was blocked. The phrase kept echoing in Julian's mind, like an uncomfortable sound he couldn't silence. For years he had believed she had simply disappeared, that she had decided to move on with her life without him, that the silence was mutual. But now he understood that the silence wasn't accidental. It was a consequence of a life so insulated that not even the birth of his daughter managed to penetrate the filters he himself had created. I need to understand everything, he finally said, his voice low but firm. Chloe's mother sat down carefully on the sofa, as if her body carried more weight than it appeared. The day she was born, she began. I tried to call you more than 10 times. Julian closed his eyes for an instant. 10 times. 10 opportunities that never reached him. Then I went to your office, she continued. Your assistant told me you were in an international meeting, that you couldn't be interrupted for personal matters. That phrase struck him with brutal clarity. Personal matters. His daughter had been classified as a distraction. Julian felt a mix of rage and shame. He perfectly remembered that negotiation, a multi-million-dollar deal that marked the beginning of his global expansion. He had given clear instructions not to receive unnecessary calls, and unknowingly, he had closed the door to the most important thing in his life. I didn't know you were pregnant, he whispered. She looked at him with a mix of disbelief and sadness. I told you before you left. He shook his head slightly. I don't remember. She nodded with painful serenity. Because you were already thinking about your next trip. The silence was heavy. There were no shouts, no exaggerated drama, just a raw truth. Julian understood that it wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't solely the fault of an ambitious assistant or a cold system. It was the result of misplaced priorities. When I understood you weren't coming back, she continued, I decided not to pursue you anymore. I didn't want my daughter to grow up feeling her father didn't choose her. Julian felt his heart constrict because that was exactly the reality. He hadn't chosen her, not because he didn't want her, but because he never knew he should. But the effect was the same. Absence. Chloe had fallen asleep on the small sofa, hugging her drawing, her innocence oblivious to the weight of that conversation. Julian observed her with a mix of tenderness and guilt. Why did you never try to find me afterwards? He asked. She took a deep breath. Because love isn't begged for. That phrase was a lesson in itself. Julian had lived in a world where everything could be negotiated, where everything had a price, where everything could be adjusted with enough influence. But love doesn't work like that. I didn't come tonight to confront you, she continued. I came because Chloe insisted she wanted to sit in that restaurant. She said her dad might be there someday. Julian felt a shiver. The girl hadn't chosen him by chance. She had recognized him. Without knowing him, she had felt something. She always looked at men who resembled you, the mother said. She always held on to hope. Julian clenched his fists. There was a part of him that wanted to turn back time, to return to the day he decided to leave, to the moment he chose the contract instead of the conversation. But time doesn't negotiate, and he knew that better than anyone. When did you know you were sick? He asked carefully. She lowered her gaze to her hands. About a year ago. Heart problems. I need surgery soon. And how have you managed all this alone? She looked at him with a slight, tired smile. How do mothers manage when they have no other option? That answer held no heroism. It held reality. Julian walked slowly around the small flat, observing the simple table, the old fridge, the medicines on the shelf. Every detail was tangible proof of a life that existed without him, a life that struggled without his support. I'm going to transfer money right now, he said, pulling out his phone. She stood up. Wait. Julian looked at her. I don't want this to start with a bank transfer. He frowned. You need the surgery. Yes, she replied. But I need to know if you need to change too. That question left him still. He had never considered his own emotional need. He had always believed that success was enough. What do you mean? She looked at him with direct honesty. If you only come to solve everything with money, you'll leave again when you feel you've fulfilled your duty. Julian slowly put his phone away. I don't want to fulfill a duty. I want to stay. The words came out without calculation, and that scared him. Because staying implied giving up certain things. It implied reorganizing priorities. It implied making space for someone else. It implied vulnerability. Then, start with something small, she said. What? Stay tonight. Julian felt a slight vertigo. His agenda was packed. He had an early meeting, a flight scheduled, but for the first time, none of those things seemed urgent. He looked at Chloe sleeping, her small breath peaceful, her hand still clutching the drawing of My Family. Julian understood that this was the first real test, not surgery, not a transfer presence. I'll stay, he finally said. She observed him, searching for any sign of doubt. She found none. The sofa's not comfortable, she warned. I didn't come for comfort. That phrase marked an invisible turning point. That night he wouldn't sleep in his king-size bed. There would be no room service. There would be no controlled silence. There would be reality. As they prepared a blanket for him, Julian felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Humility. Not the feigned humility at conferences, not the strategic humility in front of investors. Real humility. He sat on the sofa next to Chloe. The girl stirred slightly in her sleep and, without opening her eyes, murmured, Dad. Julian felt something unravel within his chest. That simple murmur held more value than any signed contract. The mother watched silently from the small kitchen. She wasn't completely convinced, but she had seen something different in him, something that hadn't been there before. Julian looked up at her. I'm sorry, he finally said. It wasn't an elaborate speech. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't an extensive explanation. It was a simple apology, and in that simplicity, there was truth. She held his gaze. Don't tell me, she replied. Show her. Julian nodded. He knew words were insufficient. That night, as the small flat fell into shadow, Julian understood something fundamental. Success isn't measured in figures. It's measured in absences, and he had accumulated too many. But there was still time. Perhaps not to erase, but to rebuild. And as Chloe slept with her hand resting on his, Julian made the most important decision of his life. He wouldn't invest in another company. He would invest in staying. However, the real test wouldn't be that night. It would be the next day, when the corporate world called, when pressures returned, when his partners questioned his change. That's when it would be known if his transformation was a momentary emotion or the beginning of a new version of himself. And dawn was just a few hours away. Dawn timidly entered through the small flat window. There were no silk curtains, no smart home system programming the light, no assistants waiting for instructions, just a golden ray illuminating Chloe's sleeping face, and Julian, sitting on the sofa, awake for hours. He hadn't been able to sleep, not because the sofa was uncomfortable, but because reality weighed more than any luxury mattress. He watched his daughter breathe with that tranquility only children have when they feel protected. And he understood something painful. She slept peacefully because she believed her dad was there, but he knew he still hadn't proven anything. The mother emerged from the bedroom with slow steps. Her face showed the accumulated weariness of years, but also a new expression, cautious hope. "You're not used to this," she said softly. Julian shook his head. "No." She approached the small kitchen and began to make coffee. The aroma filled the space. "I have a doctor's appointment today," she commented without looking at him. Julian looked up. "I'm coming with you." She paused for just a second before continuing to move. "You have work. Not today." That answer was simple, but it marked an internal break. His phone vibrated in his pocket once, then again, then a third time. He didn't need to look at it to know what it was. Urgent messages, calls from partners, meeting reminders. The corporate world was beginning to demand his attention. Julian slowly took it out and turned it off. The gesture was small, but symbolic. The mother observed him sideways. "Sure?" He nodded. "If I can't do this, then nothing else matters." Chloe began to stir on the sofa, slowly opened her eyes, and seeing him still there, smiled as if the world was in order. "Good morning, Dad." The word was no longer an unconscious whisper. It was conscious, decided. Julian felt that simple phrase carried more weight than any business title. "Good morning, darling." The mother closed her eyes for a second, as if the scene both pained and healed her. After a simple breakfast, they left for the public hospital clinic, where she had her appointment. The building didn't have the gleam of the private centers Julian frequented. The chairs were uncomfortable. The walls needed paint. The atmosphere was charged with uncertainty. And there he sat waiting, without privileges, without preferential access, just as a man worried about someone he loved. The mother looked at him. "You don't have to stay for the whole consultation." "Yes, I do." Chloe played with a small doll she carried in her pocket. Every now and then, she looked up to make sure he was still there, and each time she saw him, she smiled. That smile was his constant test. When the mother was finally called, Chloe squeezed Julian's hand. "It's going to hurt her a lot." Julian swallowed. "We'll listen to what the doctor says, and then we'll see how to help her." He didn't promise impossibilities, didn't disguise reality, but he also didn't flee. The three of them entered. The doctor professionally explained that the surgery needed to be done soon, that the risk increased with time, that they needed a quick decision. Julian listened to every word as if it were a verdict. It wasn't a contract, it wasn't an investment, it was life. The mother maintained her composure, but her hand trembled slightly. Chloe looked at both of them with wide eyes. "Mum, will she get better?" The doctor spoke cautiously. "With the surgery, the chances are good." Julian took a breath. "Have it done in the best hospital possible." The doctor looked up, surprised by his determination. "That comes at a high cost." Julian held his gaze. "It doesn't matter," the mother interjected. "Yes, it does." Julian looked at her. "I'm not buying absolution," he said firmly. "I'm doing what I should have done from the beginning." She held his gaze for a few seconds and nodded. The decision was made, but the real test came at that instant. His phone, which he had turned off, began to vibrate again as he turned it on to make a transfer. Dozens of messages, a critical meeting brought forward, an investment that depended on his physical presence. One of his partners wrote, "If you're not here today, we lose the deal." Julian felt the old reflex try to activate that impulse to run, to prioritize business, to say, "This can't wait." But this time something was different. He looked at Chloe. She was drawing on a piece of paper from the consultation room. There were three figures again, holding hands, and this time the father figure was closer. Julian understood that this was the real negotiation. Not with partners, not with markets, but with his own coherence. He picked up the phone, wrote a brief message, "Will not be there." "Family priority." He sent it. Immediate silence in the chat. Then an incredulous reply. "Since when?" Julian left the phone on the table. "Since today," he didn't say aloud, but he felt it. The mother observed the gesture. "You just lost millions," she said calmly. Julian looked at her. "I already lost 5 years. That was more expensive." She didn't respond, but something in her expression changed. Respect. When they left the clinic, the air felt different, not because the problems were resolved, but because the direction had changed. They walked in silence for a few minutes. Chloe held both their hands, an imperfect family, but trying to be real. "Will you stay when Mum's in surgery?" the girl asked. Julian crouched in front of her. "I'm not going anywhere." The mother observed him intently. She knew words were easy. The difficult part would be to sustain them over time. But she had seen something new that morning. She had seen renunciation, she had seen choice, she had seen coherence, and that wasn't easily faked. That night, as they returned to the flat, Julian felt something he had never experienced in a boardroom. Fear. Not fear of losing money, not fear of public failure, but fear of failing as a father again. That fear didn't paralyze him, it propelled him. They sat down to a simple dinner. Chloe spoke excitedly about school, about a friend, about a story she wanted him to hear. Julian listened with absolute attention. He didn't interrupt, didn't check his watch, didn't review messages presents. The mother watched him from the kitchen. There was still pain. There were open wounds, but there was also something unexpected. Hope. When Chloe went to sleep, the flat fell silent. Julian and the mother stood face to face. "This doesn't erase the past," she said softly. "I know, and I don't forgive you yet." He nodded. "I didn't come to ask for immediate forgiveness." She looked at him intensely. "I came to see if you could stay." Julian took a deep breath. "I don't know how to do it perfectly, but I want to learn." The sincerity was new in him. No strategy, no prepared speech, just truth. She nodded slowly. "Then, let's start tomorrow." Julian understood that reconstruction wouldn't be a single event. It would be a day-by-day process, choice by choice. And as he looked at the small room where Chloe slept peacefully, he understood that the greatest wealth he had ignored for years was just a few steps away. But something was still missing. The surgery, the recovery, the adaptation, and a final test that would challenge his transformation, because the outside world wouldn't easily accept his change. And soon he would have to defend this new priority to those who never understood the value of staying. The hardest battle wouldn't be against the past. It would be against the old version of himself. And that battle was just beginning. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. 7 days. 7 days that seemed like a short time for the world, but an eternity for someone trying to rebuild what he had destroyed with absence. Julian didn't return to his mansion that week. He cancelled meetings, delegated decisions, reorganized his schedule. His partners began to grow uneasy. Some called directly, others sent ambiguous messages. One even showed up unannounced outside the modest building where he now spent most of his time. "What are you doing?" that incredulous partner asked, looking at the surroundings with obvious discomfort. Julian held his gaze without hesitation. "What I should have done years ago." The partner frowned. "You're risking enormous investments for a personal situation." Julian took a deep breath. Before, that phrase would have made him react. He would have felt challenged. He would have defended his position with figures and arguments. But now, he didn't need to convince anyone. "It's not a personal situation," he replied with firm serenity. "It's my daughter." The partner remained silent for a few seconds. "You never mentioned a daughter?" Julian held his gaze. "I was never there for her." The silence was awkward. The partner attempted one last pressure. "The market doesn't wait. If you miss this opportunity, it might not come back." Julian looked towards the flat window where Chloe was drawing with absolute concentration. "Some opportunities never come back," he finally said. "I already lost her once." The partner understood that he wouldn't change his decision and left. Julian calmly closed the door. That was the real test. Not the surgery, not the money. It was holding his choice against the world that had always defined him. That night, while helping Chloe with her homework, the girl looked up. "Are you going to leave when Mum goes into hospital?" Julian put the pencil down on the table. "No, even if work calls." The question was innocent, but sharp. Julian smiled softly. "Mum says adults sometimes say that, but they don't always follow through." Julian felt the sting. It wasn't an accusation. It was experience. "Then look at me," he said, "and you decide if I follow through." Chloe observed him for a few seconds, as if evaluating his sincerity, then smiled. "I believe you." That trust shook him more than any corporate pressure, because it was fragile and could easily break. The days passed between medical appointments, preparations, and simple moments. Julian learned to prepare simple breakfasts. He learned to read stories with exaggerated intonation. He learned to listen to stories without checking his watch. Every gesture seemed small, but for him, it was revolutionary. The mother watched everything cautiously. One night, while Chloe slept, they sat facing each other. "I didn't think you'd stay," she admitted. "Neither did I," he replied honestly. She looked at him intently. "What changed?" Julian took a few seconds to respond. I discovered that everything I built made no sense if I didn't know who I was building it for. She lowered her gaze. You always wanted to win. He nodded. But I didn't understand that winning was also staying. That phrase hung in the air. The surgery arrived. The hospital was modern, thanks to Julian's decision to move her to a specialized center. The mother was outwardly calm, but her hands revealed fear. Chloe held Julian's hand tightly. It's going to hurt her a lot. Julian crouched to her height. The doctors know what they're doing, and I'm going to be here the whole time. The mother looked at him before entering the operating theater. There were no grand speeches, just a gaze filled with history. Don't leave her alone, she said. Never again, he replied. The door closed. The wait began. Hours that felt like days. Julian didn't look at his phone, didn't check emails, didn't reply to messages. He sat beside Chloe, explaining what he could, without lying to her. He told her stories, talked about stars, promised her that no matter what happened, she wouldn't be alone. In the midst of waiting, his phone vibrated insistently. It was the same critical negotiation he had postponed. A final message appeared. Last chance. Confirm your presence now. Julian looked at the screen. That decision would define not only his career, but his coherence. He looked at Chloe. The girl was leaning on his shoulder, trying to be brave. Julian turned off his phone again. No drama, no doubt, just choice. Hours later, the doctor came out. The surgery was successful. Chloe launched herself into Julian's arms. I told you she'd be okay. Julian felt tears he couldn't hold back. They weren't tears of guilt. They were tears of relief. The mother was moved to recovery. When they could finally see her, Julian held her hand. It went well, he whispered. She slowly opened her eyes, looked at him, and for the first time in years, she didn't see distance. She saw presence. Days later, as she recovered at home, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the flat. It was from one of his main partners. It stated that despite his absence, they decided to uphold the agreement, that his stance on family had generated unexpected respect, that even investors valued leaders with clear principles. Julian read the letter in silence. He hadn't expected that outcome, but he understood something profound. When you choose what's right, the world might take time to understand it, but it eventually respects it. Chloe approached. Is it from work? He nodded. Are you going to get in trouble? Julian smiled. No, not this time. The girl hugged him. Then you won. Julian looked at her tenderly. Yes, but not because of work. She frowned with curiosity. Then why? He held her with firmness and gentleness at the same time. Because I stayed. Chloe smiled as if that answer was enough, and it was. That night, as the three of them dined together at a small table, but full of conversation, Julian understood that transformation wasn't a single event. It was a daily decision. He had passed the hardest test, choosing to be a father. But something still remained. It wasn't enough to stay. He had to build. And in that small flat, among children's drawings and medicines neatly arranged on a shelf, Julian knew that the true wealth wasn't in his bank accounts. It was in the trust of a little girl who decided to believe in him, and that trust he now had to protect with everything he had. The following months weren't perfect. There was no magical transformation, no instant reconciliation. There was no fairy tale life. There was reality, there was adaptation, there were uncomfortable conversations, there were memories that hurt, but above all, there was presence. Chloe's mother recovered little by little. The surgery had been successful, but the process required patience. Julian reorganized his life without publicly announcing it. He reduced travel, delegated strategic functions, stopped attending events he once considered indispensable. His partners noticed the change. Some drifted away, others were surprised. A few even began to imitate him. Because when a leader changes their priorities, something shifts around them. But the most profound change didn't happen in the corporate world. It happened in the small flat, where every afternoon Chloe ran to the door when she heard his footsteps. Dad's here. That phrase became the most valuable sound in his life. Julian learned things he had never considered important. He learned that school homework can be more urgent than a board meeting, that listening to a story repeated 5 times has more impact than a conference, that a spontaneous hug can heal years of distance. He learned to be present without an agenda, to stay without checking the clock, to listen without interrupting. One afternoon, while Chloe was drawing at the table, she looked up. Do you remember when you let me sit with you at the restaurant? Julian smiled. Yes. I already knew it was you then. Julian tilted his head. How? Chloe shrugged with childlike naturalness. Because you looked sad, and Mum says sad people sometimes just need someone to really look at them. Julian felt a lump in his throat. For years, no one had truly looked at him. They had admired him, needed him, respected him, but they hadn't seen him. This little girl did, and that changed everything. With time, Julian decided something more. He didn't just want to help from within his home. He wanted to transform what he had learned into something bigger. He began funding programs for absent fathers. He created counseling spaces for men who had prioritized work over family. He invested in public clinics that served mothers without resources. But this time, he didn't do it for image. There were no press conferences, no plaques with his name. There was silent action. One evening, as the three of them walked through a nearby park, Chloe took both their hands. Now we're a real family. The mother and Julian looked at each other. There were scars, there was history, there were mistakes, but there was also decision. Yes, he replied, because now we choose each other every day. Chloe smiled, satisfied. Julian understood something essential. Being a father wasn't a title, it was a daily practice. It wasn't an event, it was constancy. One afternoon, while organizing boxes to move to a larger, not luxurious but comfortable place, Chloe found her old drawing, the one with the 3 figures holding hands. She held it up with pride. Look, she said, now it really looks like us. Julian observed the drawing. The father figure was no longer distant. He was in the center, firmly holding both hands. Thank you for believing in me, he whispered. Chloe frowned tenderly. I didn't believe. I knew. That childlike certainty was the greatest gift he received. In time, the old flat was left behind. Not out of shame, not out of rejection, but because now they could grow together. The new home had no excesses. It had balance. Julian was still successful, but he was no longer obsessed. He had learned to say no to unnecessary meetings. He had learned that money is a tool, not an identity. He had learned that absence is more costly than any financial loss. One night, while Chloe slept, the mother approached Julian. Do you know what surprised me the most? She asked. What? That you didn't try to defend yourself when you learned the truth. Julian took a deep breath, because there was no possible defense. She nodded. And that's what changed everything. Humility wasn't weakness, it was maturity. Julian understood that true leadership isn't exercised in boardrooms. It's exercised in intimate decisions, in staying when it's easier to leave, in listening when it's more comfortable to ignore, in taking responsibility when it's tempting to justify. Years later, when Chloe was older, a teacher asked her to write an essay about the person who had surprised her most in her life. Chloe wrote, "My dad surprised me because he decided to stay. He didn't talk about money, he didn't talk about businesses, he didn't talk about gifts, he talked about presence." When Julian read those lines, he understood that his greatest legacy wouldn't be buildings or investments. It would be that phrase, he decided to stay. Sometimes, we believe that success is measured by what we accumulate, what we achieve, what we show the world. But life silently evaluates us in another way. It asks us, were you there when someone needed you? Did you choose to stay when it was uncomfortable? Did you truly see those around you? The wealthy businessman in this story had everything, except the most important thing. And it was a simple question asked by a hungry, hopeful child that forced him to awaken. Dad, can I eat with you? That question wasn't just about food. It was about companionship, presence, love. Because in the end, we don't remember how much we earned. We remember who was there. If today you have the opportunity to stay, do it. If you can call, call. If you can listen, listen. Because time doesn't come back, but decisions can change the future. And sometimes the greatest act of love isn't promising, it's staying.